Well, at the start, they'll have to undertake a preliminary ecological appraisal, and that's really important to understand your baseline for your biodiversity net gain assessment. They will run that baseline to understand what value you have on site, an existing site. And that's the basis of how this all starts. Same time, you also need to engage a landscape architect alongside your project architect. So you have a client team there that is basically slightly larger than initially, as in the scope is slightly bigger at the beginning. Once you probably have a concept design, it would be good to, what we do is we run our assessment on our concept design, and then you'll understand roughly where you are between, how far down, how far out you are for your biodiversity net gain. And you may be down minus 30%, 20%. And then it's about creating an environment where the architect, the civil engineers, the landscape architect, and the ecologist who's now wearing design hat, and you start to develop your site layout, applying mitigation hierarchy principles. So that is principally looking at how to try to avoid the priority habitats or the quality areas of biodiversity if you can. And then that process is a holistic process that's ongoing. And so by REBA stage 2, you hopefully will run another biodiversity net gain assessment before planning. That has got an optimum site layout that's looking to deliver plus 10% net gain, but it's all about that team set up and that environment that you do at that point. But do this early is all I'll say. If you plan this early, it's a better outcome for biodiversity. It's a get a better site layout, and you'll get more cost certainty around at that start.
Thanks, Neil. Early and early. Rachel, how does it look from the planning authority's point of view?
Definitely early consideration of BMG and clear plans that are submitting. I think the key thing to remember, the Planning Advisory Service does a lot of work with local planning authorities, and especially on BMG. And the clear thing that's coming through is that all local planning authorities are different. Some, like Wiltshire, are lucky enough to have an ecology team. Others outsource the ecology team. Others don't have any resource at all. So you've got a complete spectrum of different approaches at local authorities, and any submissions needs to take into account that there will be different resources able to look through those documents. Many local authorities don't feel very prepared as yet for BMG, and I think there's an awful lot of guidance that's still to come out from government. And I think that's something that's worth making a point on, because anything that does come in needs to be assessed and be as clear as possible in that respect. I think there's also the balance that the local authorities are trying to deal with from the planning side. So sites may have, or are likely to have, urban design issues as well as ecology, and it's having those master plan approaches and having early consideration to balance those competing resources, competing space.
Great stuff, Rachel. Thanks a lot. Rory, do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience at One Horton Heath, and if there's anything you'd like to add about getting the right team lined up?
I think it's really important to consider short and long-term management and maintenance plans, and making sure that you have a team that understands them, ensuring that, we speak about B&G and how we will, improve that. But it's important before you deliver that B&G to maintain that baseline at a certain level. And then once it's implemented, making sure that you've got the right team with the right understanding to deliver those requirements. In an urban environment, arguably, a concrete slab, 10% biodiversity net gain of zero is zero. So where you could, of course, you can deliver important biodiversity on those smaller sites, but actually, are you better to contribute to an off-site scheme, and where the impact would be certainly greater and potentially have additional environmental benefits?
Okay, that's a thread I think we're going to pick up later on. Certainly, thanks, Rory. Sam, what would you like to add from Balfour Beatty's perspective and from your own experience?
Well, we're coming at the project as the principal contractor, so although we'll be working with designers, obviously, and clients, we tend to be doing the practical delivery. And for biodiversity net gain to work in that context is utterly fundamental to make sure that you have the expertise integrated across the team. So you need to have biodiversity guidance and input at all stages of the actual delivery process. So that's not just sort of temporally, but across disciplines as well. We used to have this sort of idea that it was all about, you get the ecologist in beforehand, during the site clearance, and then maybe a bit at the end during the landscaping. That system won't work effectively for delivery of net gain. We need to have integration throughout. It might be drainage disciplines, earthworks, these sorts of things where you might not previously have considered the need to have an ecologist present, but actually how we manage things like our soil management will fundamentally dictate how effectively we can deliver net gain or not. So massive emphasis on integration and collaboration across delivery.
Okay, this is a serious investment for in any development. It's absolutely clear that there is a large amount of logistical work needed beforehand to get a good team together. Rachel, I wonder if you could tell us about moving the discussion on to our next section about aligning clients and contractors and developers and some of the niceties and nuances around that, and also perhaps pick up on viewer Glenn Slater's question, which is, does the 10% BNG requirement apply to all sizes and types of scheme in all local authority areas?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of aligning that client, contractor and developer, it's interesting to hear sort of from the kind of installation field from the local planning authority side. We're very much reviewing the planning applications and then looking at those different stages and then looking towards monitoring and reporting going forward. One thing that we have been considering in a lot of detail is that on-site versus off-site provision, and if you run out of space on site, then those off-site options are needed. So local authorities need to be alive to those strategic approaches coming through. And one thing that I've been doing at Wiltshire is looking at our own land holding as a local planning authority and actually going through that process of delivering our own potentially strategic BNG schemes. We're then able to flip that across to see how that's coming through from the planning and the developer side and what processes we need. And that includes getting the legal agreements in place, but also that monitoring and reporting both of habitats, but also of units. So there's a lot of areas still that we are waiting for further legislation on, but that we're having to pilot projects and see how that works. In terms of which planning applications come through, there are exemptions, but generally from November 23, it will be the major applications will need to have biodiversity net gain of 10%, and that will be mandatory. And then from, I think it's next spring, the smaller sites will also need to come forward with BNG. There are exemptions and they're listed in the guidance that comes out from government.
Broadly speaking, what are the parameters around exemptions?
It's to do with the size of the development. So some householder, I think, small extensions are excluded, and then there's other consents, etc. So there's a whole list of them. I'd have to check out the actual detail, but yeah, there's some exceptions, less than they thought originally, and certainly there's also separate legislation coming in for NSIPs as well.
Right, thanks, Rachel. Adam, how do you go? What advice are you offering on aligning client, contractor, and developer, and the sort of unique perspective of a construction framework?
Well, I think it's really vital to make sure, as Sam said, to get that expertise really baked into the team, and I would really strongly urge bringing this up as part of any stakeholder engagement. So whether or not it's a residential development with sort of local community, or it is an infrastructure asset, making sure that this is something that is discussed in those early consultation stages. And just bear in mind that your usual supply chain might not carry the experience or expertise, but that local community will be able to network within itself. So there might be other suppliers in the area who can work together to bring that experience and expertise to bear. And again, as Rachel said, the public sector are pretty major landholders in many places. So actually being able to talk about the ambitions, the opportunities, and the biodiversity inherently in already baked in with those landholders can mean that the supply chain can act as a conduit to opportunities to work together. I know in Hampshire County Council, who host SCF and the NACF, we've had some really major challenges with nutrient contamination in the Solent, and had to learn really fast to unlock the development in line with the public need in the area. And it's been vital not only to have that network of close relationships with supply chain, but also being able to network within other public bodies in the area. There's a lot of diverse and differently sized authorities across the Solent region alone, and the need to work together as client groups to address these common problems is really important. I mean, there are sometimes conflicting needs around public bodies in that area who hold not only the environmental stewardship of this unique coastal region, but also the need to develop to deliver housing and infrastructure. So just can't stress enough how those client relationships can be really useful, and the supply chain can be really instrumental in pulling those together and being able to pool resource and expertise.
Thanks, Adam. I'm happy to take views on this from the rest of the panel as well. But to you specifically, Adam, what, in your experience, how mature is that supply chain for BNG? You know, is it easy to find the experts that you need?
I think it's difficult to find any expert at the moment with the labour market, and experience is so varied. But there are so much resource out there. I see Rachel's just shared the Planning Advisory Service and some links. So, so PAS are there to be able to guide through. I think lots of the tier one suppliers are coming to bear on being able to advise on these legislation. And I think it's not necessarily about holding this particular expertise. We work in an industry of constantly evolving and changing legislation. It's more about making sure that you have the governance and processes in place to be able to respond in due course, and to have those relationships on standby, so that one can respond to them. Because I can see this being an evolving issue. It's certainly something in Hampshire County Council and the wider public sector. It is at top of the agenda is environmental protection. So I can see this. There'll be some evolution in legislation still yet to come. So I think it's more about being in a position to react quickly, rather than a mad rush to secure a particular expertise, because these new legislative processes, they come with guidance. There are resources available, and I do think it's much more about process and relationship than it is on any one of the many varied legislation of which this is only but one or two.
Thanks, Adam. Neil, feel free to pick up on that thread, but also I'd like your experience, the benefit of your experience in aligning client and contractor and developer on BNG.
So the MOJ has a policy, had written a policy, I think 2-3 years ago, as a plus 10% biodiversity net gain. So that underpinned what we were going to deliver. So it was ahead of the government's mandatory requirement, which is helpful because that's what we had to deliver against. And what we built in was actually float on that, because what we understand, so when I say float, we submitted to planning on 4 of our sites, 33%, 26%, a 23%, and a 15%. And that's what happens at planning is as Rachel was saying, it's scrutinized by the local authority ecologists. And at the end of the day, this is professional opinion. Our ecologists will input all that data into the metric, and we've used metric 2, metric 3, metric 3.1 in all this process, and it's always been constantly evolved by Natural England. And in one case, it was scrutinized. There was a difference of opinion and challenged on some of our grassland, and there was a whole process of where that actually dropped about 5% the figure down, because one area, when we did further surveys on it, botanical surveys on it, actually one area was slightly a better condition than our ecologists had put in the metric at the time. And you need that float. So that scrutiny, and then it's under the section 106 that is secured. And also another thing we've realized this through this process, we may be declaring 26% or 33%, but actually don't want the planning condition to hit you on ring fences at 33%. You want it written so you're doing biodiversity net gain, but that float remains through stages 3 and 4 when you brought the contractor on. And RMA, your design will have a little bit of chop and change. It will go through when the contractor comes on. There may be a late design change, not fundamentally huge, but it will affect the biodiversity net gain figure, and you need, and ultimately often goes down towards another 5% drop, 6%. So one of our sites which has now gone to site, which was at 50%, has gone to construction at 10.1%. There's one currently dropped another 5% because of another thing. So you need that float. I'd advise, if you can, put it into the system. And we brought the contractor in at end of stage 2, stage 3, and lining them and getting them to understand how this works is really key. And I would echo Sam's point, you need your ecologists all the way through. They don't stop. They're coming in because you'll run a B&G assessment again at stage 4 to see what you're going to site with, to see what your real true figure is at that stage. So yeah, there's coordination all the way through now in that respect.
Thanks, Neil. I'm just going to point out, Sam, I want to come to you next on this idea of B&G being a core component of any project. I just want to mention, though, we've got a viewer who's asking for the links that Rachel sent out. All viewers, we will send you details of all the links that go in the chat and all of the chat and the answers that panelists put up and so on, along with a link to the video after this event. So you'll receive all those links, don't worry. Sam.
Yeah, so I think actually drawing on the point that Adam made, it is all about relationships at the end of the day. And I think recognizing the fundamental role that biodiversity net gain has as a key project deliverable, i.e. project success, is not only a legal requirement, but the success of that project is going to be in part determined by delivery of biodiversity net gain. And the way to align client, contractor, developer, and stakeholder is by recognizing there's a shared goal there. There's a shared incentive and a shared requirement, which actually in the different natures of those participants or organizations, you're all working towards the same goal, which is delivery of net gain. And it's like the rest of sustainability, it is becoming integrated throughout the project delivery process. So yeah, obviously we've talked a lot about in design, but also in tenders and contract. You can think about how carbon is being represented now a great deal more in and waste and other aspects of sustainability. So it's been very much included within the entire construct of the project at all the different phases. And importantly, biodiversity net gain is not about landscaping. It's about delivering habitats. So we're looking at it in a different way. So you're not just going out and counting the number of trees that you've got that are sustainable, that are growing well or need to be replaced or what have you. You're talking about a woodland habitat or whatever that habitat might be. So there's a difference there, and that difference needs to be embraced and recognized. We're doing very similar things, but actually there's quite a deep philosophical change as well, which needs to be embraced by all of those interested parties.
It strikes me that the impact of this is much greater than the sort of 10% by the words imply. That when you start digging into this, that there's a really fundamental a cultural change needed in the industry to cope with it. Rory, what do you want to tell us about the phasing of biodiversity net gain?
Well, I think has been noted previously, the relationships and understanding between all parties is really key, and then that for me then leads on to the phasing of that delivery. So the project that I'm involved in at the moment is effectively a 10 or so year build on a 310 acre site, and the phasing is really important. Can we deliver phases of biodiversity net gain in advance or early on? And are any of those going to be affected with subsequent phases of delivery, as Neil pointed out? So it's really important to build that, gain that understanding from your consultants, build that relationship, and get everyone on board so that we can start to deliver these pockets of green infrastructure and so on and so forth, so that the communities can start benefiting from it, and so can our wildlife.
Thanks, Rory. Do you want, I don't know if you're in a position to answer. We got the ominous anonymous attendee, but he's not asking anything malevolent. They're asking what options are available to local authorities for enforcing BNG. So on your scheme, what's the sort of enforcement protocol around it? How does it work? Who's actually got responsibility?
I mean, Rachel's probably better to respond to this one, but ultimately, you know, it goes back to the local authority to ensure that these things are delivered and managed accordingly, which then goes back to the fact that local authorities are going to be under greater pressure to ensure that the developers out there deliver their management plans as, you know, has been illustrated.
Thanks, Rory. Rachel, do you want to pick up on that and maybe talk a little bit about the affordability of all of this enforcement and management that's falling to local authorities?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's two things here. One is, as you go through your planning process, you obviously submit plans of your BNG. The key thing that as local planning authority ecologists we're looking at is the baseline correct, and is the future prediction of habitats correct given the management? So is everyone being realistic on both sides of the coins? You then, of course, get the scheme approved and it is then delivered, and there's a requirement for later monitoring and the later checking up. Now that will fall to the local planning authorities. We're waiting for more secondary legislation just to talk to set out the details, but that resourcing element is not something that's been a statutory function. It is not something that's well resourced for local authorities, but it is something that everyone is having to think about. So you may well get a scheme with a detailed management plan setting out what monitoring a management company or a developer will do on that habitat for 30 years. So, but that also has to be checked by the local authority. So there needs to be resource that somebody is monitoring and checking that. Even if you get a report, you need to be able to check it and review it and be able to then action enforcement. And I think it's just, you know, there was a question in the chat about how well is it going to work. It will work well if everyone is being precautionary and is being realistic about everything, and it doesn't just become a numbers game. I think, you know, we already see areas where there's a high expectation for what can be delivered on a site, an overestimation perhaps, and I think everyone has to be realistic if we are going to get good outcomes for the environment from that. But certainly how local authorities resource that, we're waiting for more information from government on new burdens. But I think from a Wiltshire perspective, we're looking at how can we self-resource this? Can we make sure we take contributions for us to do that monitoring and that reporting? Because otherwise it potentially won't be funded. It might be, but we don't know.
Thank you, Rachel. Neil, the ominous words contributions has entered the conversation, so feel free to pick up on that, and we're gonna return to that when we talk about the kind of longer term monitoring of sites shortly as well. But also I'd like you to talk a bit about what happens when the plans hit reality. You know, what are the on-site challenges and learning from doing this in practice on a construction site?
So funny enough, 3 of ours are still in planning, one. And there's other programs of works going on, smaller programs of work which I can lean on. But interestingly, in terms of when the contractor, some of these are the big developments, and what we found out when the contractor comes in with logistics, for example, and they go, well, we're going to build this here, but we're going to set up over here. And we've been caught out a couple of times where temporary works, for instance, and we want to set up a car park for the staff, you know, for the contractors or a layout site, and that's particularly on a site that hasn't had its preliminary ecological appraisal, and actually that's a hit on biodiversity that wasn't put in our figures, and it's only a temporary because it may be only set up for 2-3 years. So there's a little bit, it's interesting, the practicalities of what to watch out for is quite interesting when it comes to logistics from a contractor's point of view, because that's, the BNG hasn't really caught up with that. We haven't really managed to catch up with that, and we were making sure now that's a lot tighter, so that where they set up, being much more careful about how that works, because it's, you know, these are big projects, 4 years to be construct, and so there's a certain amount of logistics there that needs to be worked through on BNG that I don't think fully is being worked through enough, and we're finding that one out, interestingly. In terms of the actual BNG delivery on the site that we have got. As I said, we went through a process that actually we ended up with 10%, having gone through the BNG assessment with the contractor at the time they start on site the main works. So in theory, there's not going to be a change to that. They will deliver that over the 3 years construction. There is interesting bits on, as you say, maintaining the habitat baseline as it was, so it doesn't change its, it's quite a long construction period. So there is a bit of to watch out for that. But, if it's secured under the planning of Section 106 and you deliver that, you've got the LEPs, the landscape and environmental management plans, etc., that go on the back of that. We haven't got through further on this stage in terms of long-term management, but they are MOJ sites. It's all delivery on site, this biodiversity net again, I should say. So they do have set up estate management teams. The bit we've got to close out is updating the FM manuals. These are new biodiversity net gain habitats that are going in the manuals that previously there's a process. We're working closely with MOJ to update those manuals. They have estate teams. There will be some prisoner sort of programs as well as long term. So there is a bit of a social value prisoner piece of work going on with that. But we're in a sort of, in terms of the governance, the MOJ and the looking after, it's on their estate generally. So there is a certain more confidence for the local authority that will be looked after up to 60 years, because the prison life is up to 60, 70 years in terms of its construction. Once it's built, its lifetime sort of durability. So there's a lot of confidence that these will be looked after in that respect.
Neil, we'll come back to that in a sec. Sam, can you tell us a bit about the projects that you're delivering on site and the sorts of challenges that you've come up against on a live construction site?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it kind of falls into two broad areas. One is the robustness of the design itself. So how detail has the things like soils analysis been, or other environmental factors which may affect those habitats. So it's quite easy to work with drawings and GIS files and come up with wonderful looking designs for delivery of habitats, but are those soils that you have on site going to be right for what you need to deliver? Are there other environmental factors which have been properly factored in, like I don't know, we build lots of roads, for example, so you have the amount of particulates that are going to be coming off of the carriageway. Those may have an adverse impact on different floral communities that you're trying to establish. So it's making sure that the design has been really robustly challenged and assessed in that regard. And then there are sort of echoing what Neil said, the on-site challenges you have, which are either to do with time, so the program constraints where you might be, and as Rory mentioned earlier, trying to establish habitats early on to gain as much of an establishment period prior to completion as possible. But if you created a habitat and then you haven't factored in, or there hasn't been that integration which I talked about at the beginning, where you then need to do a drainage run right through the middle of your tree planting, you've obviously wrecked that early work or a large component of it. So it's having that program awareness, but then also that spatial consideration as well. Is there actually enough room within your red line boundary to achieve what you need to do? So going back to soil management, if depending on what you're trying to create, and you're trying to just use soils on site, you might need an increased stockpile area, so you can segregate your soils more than you would do perhaps normally, so you can make sure that you're redeploying those soils, they're going into the correct places, rather than just having topsoil going back uniformly across the site. It might be a much more complicated soil management plan, and this is something that we have definitely had to get our heads around and embrace the challenges of, because it's not just landscaping, it's trying to create it's green infrastructure. Like any kind of infrastructure, you need to start with the fundamental foundational component, which is your soil often, and get that absolutely right. And to do that requires more planning, more consideration, and actually often more space as well.
And that's going to impact viability, right, on plenty of schemes, and that's the sort of unsaid word so far.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always a cost implication.
So let's have a look at that and tie it into the kind of long-term view. So to respond to viewer Emma Noyce's question around the whole lifetime management of habitats created, Rory, what can you? You said you're working on a 10-year build program, but the commitment to maintaining the habitats is much longer than that, right? So what can you tell us about how you're going about it?
So the B&G commitment, you would see a management plan for 25 years. Now, the understanding is with a biodiversity net gain is that it's over a 30-year period for managing and monitoring those areas. The thing is that not only the implementing those areas, the management of them is expensive, and it's important that you gain a good understanding of the cost implications involved. One of the benefits may be that the guidance suggests that we can stack environmental initiatives, so there might be some added benefit there. But then I suppose, when we look at the long term of the B&G, it's looking at the additional benefits. Can we engage the community and make better use of a space so that the community can benefit it through health and well-being, education, and so on and so forth. So it's really important to look at it holistically and see what additional benefit it brings.
Can you just explain the phrase stacking the incentives?
Stacking the incentives. So we're under pressure at the moment. So nutrients, so nitrates, phosphates, biodiversity net gain, suitable alternative natural green space. These are all effectively environmental initiatives, and the guidance is, as I understand it, is that we may be able to stack those initiatives. So utilise land for nutrient offset and also the biodiversity net gain, and if we're lucky, the suitable alternative natural green space. So it's about we can deliver biodiversity net gain on public open space. Yes, it's got to be managed accordingly, but it's a case of just what can we do with this land? How many layers can we add to benefit the wider community, but also the organisation?
Great, thanks very much. Rachel, I'm going to come to you in a second, but Adam, I think you wanted to just pop in an observation there.
Yeah, I think Rory made some really great points there about maximising the gain that you can get from your particular initiative, and stacking those environmental responsibilities is a good example of that. But it really does fit in well with that wider social value and public access piece as well. Now, that is legislation that's been around for 10, 11 years and is quite mature in its delivery. And it's really important to see where both the environmental legislation and the social value legislation can complement each other. So those wider community benefits that come from having a more diverse and nature-friendly environment, quite frankly, the improved amenity of a site that has been built to complement its environment, and where those are delivered on site, naturally that social value will be delivered in the communities that the developments are landing on. So it's really important to look at it in that social value sphere, and make sure that when those social value considerations are being looked at, that there are also opportunities within this biodiversity to upskill local communities, to bring the employment and skills and social part in, and use this biodiversity work as opportunities for education and employment, as well as discharging one's duty under the planning regulations.
Thanks, Adam. Rachel, so feel free to respond to that. And I'm going to hit you with a whole host of questions now. So we're talking about the kind of long-term governance of biodiversity net gain. And Nick Blackmore in the audience has also asked about thoughts on the sort of socio-economic benefits of biodiversity net gain. So how far can we go in using those benefits to perhaps balance out some of the costs? You know, how direct can we be in saying, okay, it's going to cost this much more to build, but we've got this many more, these benefits that are coming out of it. So perhaps viability is less challenged. Tackle those for now, and I'll come back. There are a couple more really interesting questions coming in from viewers.
The viability angle, I think what's interesting, I get asked the question is in terms of how much off-site biodiversity net gain might we need in Wiltshire for the forthcoming mandatory requirement, and it's a really difficult one because it depends very much on how much can be delivered on site. And what's interesting, I suppose, is if you are progressing a site with a good lot of green infrastructure, how much is an extra or tweaking the management to deliver more units? It can vary, can't it, considerably on each case as to how many units can easily be accommodated and what the cost is. I think the social value is really important because, I mean, I know that Land Trust have done quite a few studies on actually the cost of the price for houses can be increased if they're then built with, you know, good functioning green infrastructure. So there is lots of variability in terms of those costs. Certainly when you look off-site, and especially going back to the point we made at the start about planning early, when you need to buy habitat units further down the line when you're at reserve matters, that is very complex, and that then can be very expensive. So I suppose from the viability angle, good master planning and early consideration will help with that. But there will be wide benefits certainly for if you have a site in a nutrient area, potentially increasing open space, you may be able to get double benefits from that. And I've put the link there for that guidance that can be shared in due course. Yeah, so I think it's a difficult one to pinpoint exactly how much it's going to be for each house. I think it's going to very much depend, and certainly by doing a lot of planning early, hopefully that can minimise any unexpected costs.
And would you be advising local authorities to be looking at this as a potential source of revenue in order to pay for the costs of all the monitoring that's going on? I mean, we're talking about decades of commitment in terms of governance.
Yeah, so I mean, it's something that I know a number of authorities that are lucky enough to have their own land holding. So Wiltshire is able to do this, and other authorities are. But as I mentioned at the start, each local authority is different. We have a land holding, and we have started a review of our recreational areas and also of our rural estate to see how we can tweak management practices to hopefully deliver some strategic BNG site. That's to help our own delivery of affordable housing that we do as a council, but, you know, firstly, as well as potentially helping development coming forward to meet those aims that are important about delivering benefits near areas that are having development and within the local authority area and within areas for nature recovery. So it's about looking at how can we open up potential sites in our land holding that can start as a catalyst for more projects, and it is really looking at a pilot, and it's looking at the costs that we have to expend to deliver those projects ourselves, so we can understand costs when they come through from the developer side. It helps us understand how much it might cost us to do legal agreements and how much it might cost us to monitor and report. So it's preparatory work, which I think is useful for that future financial contributions and just understanding how we resource this appropriately sort of going forward.
Thanks, Rachel. Viewer Calliope Simeonidou, I hope that's answered your question. Sam, we're talking about costs now, and we've heard the sort of public sector perspective on this. How does it look from a developer's point of view?
Well, it is complicated, isn't it? And ultimately, as everyone said, there is a significant commitment and associated cost with delivering this, with delivering biodiversity net gain. And I think ultimately it's going to sit with the asset owner, be that a developer or be it a statutory body, a local authority, whoever it might be. And most of the work that I do is with large scale infrastructure. So that's primarily the asset owner will be either a local authority or it will be the likes of National Highways or Network Rail or whoever. So obviously they're having to incorporate these commitments into their business model for independent developers, I think that's a really massive challenge, and the current business practice that they have, or current historic business practice, may well need to change to incorporate this this long-term commitment, and how the ownership of the asset and how that is reflected in that cost and associated commitment is complex. And I don't have the answers to that. I mean, I think there is, it is very interesting what we've all been talking about, these added benefits. Some of them can perhaps be costed, such as the nutrient harnessing, but then you've got other things like just well-being and the mental health value of being in green spaces. And then other ones which, again, are maybe as easily able to put a cost against, things like air quality improvements and so forth. So there are lots of added benefits. And I think it's, at the moment, as business and as a industry, we get our heads around this challenge which we're facing. It's worth remembering why it is that we're doing it. It's not, we are doing it obviously because of this legislation change, but that legislation change is happening because we are in a biodiversity crisis. We are in a global and national massive biodiversity crisis, which is a significant existential threat to our future existence. So we do need to embrace this, and there are going to be some major challenges, some increased costs, and also lots of added benefits and opportunities as well. But it is maybe underpinned by legislation, but I'd say that there is an imperative for us to deliver on that game because we need this to work.
And you've had experience of development projects actually stalling because of a sudden realization of the cost implications.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a project where, in order to achieve the net gain target, there was an area within the boundary that would need to, within the budget as well and other constraints, that would need to be developed into a specific habitat type, which was all well and good, but the developer did have aspirations in a 5 to 10 year plan to then perhaps to continue their development over there. And then when we had to help them recognize the fact that that wasn't going to be an option because they had committed to this 30-year period, that ended up putting the brakes on the whole scheme because it didn't fit in with their business plan.
Yeah, so it's time to take this seriously, isn't it? I'm just going to be very selfish and point out that my colleague Nick Blackmore has pointed out that in terms of measuring the social benefits of well-being, the value of well-being and so on, we've just managed to secure, Nick's managed to secure preferential lending rates from funding institutions that are looking for ESG related investments on the back of being able to demonstrate the monetary value, if you like, the value of well-being being delivered by development. So there are all sorts of opportunities in here for looking at biodiversity net gain and other kind of social and economic benefits as ways of generating additional funding, new funding streams, given the investment environment. Neil, MOJ is a very different sort of steward than a house builder, for example. What's your view on who's going to be looking after this in the long term?
So it's an interesting one. I've sort of, for a house builder, I was on a webinar the other day, the ground control, and there are quite a few house builders on there, and their sort of handover, so to speak, to stewardship. And they definitely recognise there's a significant gap in skills, in land management skills, and also in-house in their own teams about who's got the knowledge to pass over that these are biodiversity net gain habitats. They're trying to do them on these housing schemes, and they're trying to get local community who are living in them to get involved, look after them. And there's risks with that because people might want to sell and they move on, and how do you keep that going? But they did point out some of these are on these sites for 10 years. And so they're trying to teach some local communities to get involved in long-term management, but they're complex. They're complex things. And so unless they've got that skills in land management, so there is a risk here. I think that, should that developer basically be funding a backup maintenance support into that for that 30 years, which will be a cost, to ensure that PNG of those habitats retained and meet what they were meant to do and under the assessment. So yeah, I think the industry green skills in this area is an opportunity, but for land management, even in that respect. But yeah, I think there is a little bit, there is a concern on all sides that this part, that long-term management, people are still working it through, who should be doing it. Can you rely on the local communities completely? No, but it's a good opportunity for them, but I don't think you can fully rely on that completely when you've walked away from the site.
You gave, Neil, when we were doing the sort of prep for this session, you gave us a fairly eye-opening example of a 24-hectare site that needed mitigation. Give us an idea of the kind of costs around that, just to nail it home. You know,
it's presented with a sort of it was to do with protected species of bird, and can we do this on site? We were looking to do it on site or off site, and it wasn't so much the biodiversity net games wrapped into it, but we needed to get a whole lot of grassland, and there was a farm nearby that's been flipped to a habitat bank basically, and they were offering a whole lot of arable land. They were going to turn it into a habitat bank and offer back to the market various habitats that could be created to see whether it's woodland, grasslands, etc. And we ran some very high level costs on that to create 24 hectares of specific type of grassland, and that was installation and a 30-year management, and we're looking at about 3.4 million.
Okay, so a considerable sum.
Yeah, considerable sum. And that was installation, but fully looked after by that landowner for that period. But there were sort of high level back of the envelope costs. We hadn't gone through a negotiation to see if that could come down. But significant costs are involved in creating some of these habitats.
Absolutely.
Long-term maintenance.
Thanks, Neil. Adam, I'm going to come to you in a second. Sam, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, it's just to sort of go back onto Neil's point about integrating the local sort of the homeowners residents in the habitat management and the skills level there. I think it's there's lots of really clear benefits and value in doing that, and in terms of forgetting cost, just having that commitment to your local environment, as well as we've talked about all the sort of mental health and well-being. But there is, and as Neil alluded to, there is a skills gap. And before my current role, I worked for many years in the nature conservation sector, and volunteers are amazing, and most of the charitable work that happens across all the different trusts wouldn't exist without volunteers. But there must be a strong quality assurance as well. It's quite easy to do the wrong thing for the right reason, or the right thing for the wrong reasons. But either way, there does need to be, and I think going forward over these 30 years, there's going to need to be a serious commitment and making sure that that habitat is being enhanced and delivered to the right level. So it's brilliant to bring in local people and to use them as much as possible, but I think there must be some very robust checks and balances, I think.
Thanks, Adam. I think that was playing to the point you wanted to make, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think that there's a lot to unpack. This is a really key challenge of this legislation. I think the fundamental principle of there is a cost, there will be a cost, and I think rather uniquely to the public sector, it's not necessarily about whether the business plan still works and the development is profitable. It's more about getting that budget right, and getting that budget right early, so that there aren't political barriers in the way that hold up those key infrastructure or development schemes. So again, getting that supply chain advice, as Neil said, envelope figures, and developing those as project goes on. So again, that consultation and relationship to be able to make sure that these things are budgeted properly. I mean, we live in a world where there are green levies on energy, vehicle use. So looking at it from a polluter pays environment, then why shouldn't biodiversity be something that costs money? And according to the biodiversity loss of development, one could also argue that this could encourage and incentivize more brownfield development and push developments into a place that is more sustainable in the long term. I do think as well, looking at that cost, it's not the fact that there is a cost, it's making sure that cost counts. if not on site, then maybe near site. Explore ways to make it cost effective by potentially sharing initiatives, sharing the resource to manage and run initiatives across other sites. And again, that third sector involvement, I think we shouldn't underestimate the strength of the third sector charities and organisations in stewardship, and potentially using these projects and the costs associated with delivering that BNG to upskill both in the local community, but also to help those third sector organisations become more effective and more skilled at delivering these, and potentially using some funding to upskill those those organisations that have an interest in helping run these. So we are an industry with an absolute dire skill shortage, and an industry that is a big polluter. So it's only morally right to be able to address those.
Yeah,
I think also finally for that will be sharing, making sure that one shares the challenges, shares the successes, but also the things that didn't work so well.
Yeah.
I know, across the NACF, we deliver about 7 billion of construction work annually, and that's all delivered by public sector officers in the frameworks through the supply chains. And I'd say keep an eye out. We will feature some case studies. We're always very honest about what works well and what doesn't across those schemes. So we'll make sure we publish for the benefit of all here. So we'll be updating our website with what works well and where the challenges are in due course.
Thanks, Adam. And viewers, if you want any information on anything you've heard today from any of our panelists, if you fire in a question into the chat, what you'd like to know and who you'd like to know it from, then we'll make sure that those get circulated. We'll come back to something that you said there, Adam, if we get a chance in the last moments on training. There's a question from Glenn Slater on what training courses are available to people to get a grip on this. But Rory, I wanted to come to you because you mentioned the idea of banking biodiversity net gain at the beginning of this session. And I think that's probably where the conversation is going to end as well. This idea that, with carbon saving, the first thing that everyone does is try to offset their carbon saving. So presumably the same is going to happen with BNG. How do you see that developing? Are we all going to see fantastic BNG gains in the wildernesses of Scotland, but no benefit at all in our urban centres, for example?
I think our BNG banks, if you like, I think they need to be relevant to where the development occurs. And I think we need to be mindful, where we are on the south coast. Although there's an environmental benefit if something's done in Scotland, it's no immediate benefit to our local communities. So I think we should be looking within parameters to ensure that these things are delivered within a reasonable distance from.
Do you think that based on is that your opinion, or is that what legislation is telling you?
That's my opinion, and the way I think things will possibly go. Again, Rachel or Neil might well be able to advise where.
Thanks, Rory. Let's have Rachel and then Neil.
I know the 4.0 metric, the BNG metric, is sort of if you're delivering credits near to the loss, it's basically is weighted towards that occurrence rather than if it's further afield. So it's weighted on both sides of delivering strategic BNG, but also for the developer's side. So the way that the amount of credits you would need much more if you wanted to deliver in Scotland rather than Eastleigh, essentially.
Thank you, Rachel. Neil, and so feel free to comment on that. And I'm going to do a very quick yes/no to every panelist just to close off the session based on Chris Clark's question. So do the panel think that BNG duty, unique in England, is going to work better than the system in other countries for promoting nature recovery? So Neil, your point, and then a yes/no answer to that.
Rachel answers, the metric has a spatial risk multiplier in it. The further you go away, the harder you're going to get hit in cost. Basically, you need to do it locally within reason.
Thanks, Neil. And is it going to work better? Have we got the right system? Yes or no?
No, I think it's a good start. I think it's open, it's transparent in terms of, and it's good that, as far as I'm aware, everybody is using it and will use it, and therefore from a biodiversity point of view, and then development in England, it's transparent enough to everybody's effectively, from the professional point of the ecologists that are using it are generally on board with it, and it's constantly updated and being fed back as we feed back in our workings of it and our opinions of it. So yeah, I think from where we are, yeah, absolutely, I think it's a better place to be in. Absolutely. But compared to European, you can't say.
Thanks, Neil. Sam?
It's certainly better than not having it. I don't know if I'm qualified or if I have a future detection device to tell me how well it's going to work compared to other countries. But and it's definitely not a silver bullet, but it's better to have than not have.
Faint praise. Thanks, Sam. Rachel?
I think at the minute we're fighting residual loss on site, so we're at the point where we're losing biodiversity. So yes, I think it will move to a better place.
Thanks, Rachel. Rory?
I think time will tell, but anything is a benefit at this stage.
Thank you, Rory. And finally, Adam.
I think the exact method about going about legislating and measuring is less relevant than the fact of getting those project teams right from inception through planning on site, those people constructing, using the site, getting them to think about that and consider it and understand it, all the way through the supply chain and the building in use and through its life cycle. To have it in mind that it's something that should be protected and looked after is more important than the spreadsheet that drives it.
That's almost a glib way for us to end it. It's almost like we manufactured that. It was perfect. Thank you very much indeed, panel. That's going to be our last word. So viewers, please join me in thanking our fantastic panel for sparing their valuable time to share their knowledge and experience with us today. Thank you to Sam Bauer from Balfour Beatty, and thank you to Rachel Jones from the Planning Advisory Service and Wiltshire Council, and thank you to Neil Sheriff from Mace Group, and thank you to Rory Watson-Newman from One Horton Heath and Eastleigh Borough Council, and thank you to Adam Sanford from the SCF Frameworks, and also to the wider National Association of Construction Frameworks for making this conversation possible. And most of all, as always, viewers, thank you for again tuning in and gracing us with your attention and fueling the conversation with all your questions. We've got quite a few left hanging, so if our panel are kind enough to give us answers to some of those questions, we'll be posting them in the LinkedIn Members Club shortly. And remember, we're going to be back on Friday, the 12th at 10 a.m. with the leader of Birmingham City Council, Councillor Ian Ward. But in the meantime, from our wonderful panel, from NACF and from me and from everyone at Inner Circle Consulting. Goodbye.